Hello, my name is Carrie Varela of the Reiki Healing Society, and I am joyfully joined today with Michaela Daystar of HeartScapes Reiki. And we are really happy to be here in our third video in a series that we've titled Being True to Your Way, Navigating Integrity for Reiki Practitioners. And the topic that we wanted to explore today was how to be true to and in integrity with the culture of Reiki. So we'll be diving into this conversation around cultural and spiritual appropriation, which is a sometimes very sticky and intense subject. Perhaps, and perhaps it's not. So I leave that open to you if, as you explore these topics, if you run up against some intense feelings. And so one of the things that I'd like to preface this conversation around is the container that we hold the conversation. And so based on the teacher that I've studied this with, Neil Dahl, we really held this container of compassion and self-inquiry. And so compassion in the sense that we're not perfect beings. We're not perfect people. We're very much influenced by dominant culture, by our gender, our race, our religion. And a lot of that creates implicit biases in how we relate to the world. And an implicit bias is just something that's subconscious. Like you don't realize you're biased towards an African-American person or a person from Japan because it's just deep and unconscious inside of us. And so to undo and to work through some implicit biases just helps us open our mind and be more open to all different types of people and all different types of ways of being. And so I think that what is really helpful in this conversation is just to share a definition of cultural and spiritual appropriation so that we have a common language with which to chat about these issues and discuss. So I really like this definition from Maisha Johnson. She defines cultural and spiritual appropriation to be a particular power dynamic in which members of a dominant culture take elements from a culture of people who've been systemically oppressed by that dominant group. Cultural appropriation can also involve profit. Members of the dominant culture almost always have the ability to profit off what they've stolen, providing no compensation to those from oppressed cultures. The issue is further complicated when white spiritual influencers become spokespeople for traditions that they don't belong and whose history they're unfamiliar with. This can harm the people and harm the underlying culture of these traditions, and it disconnects it from its origins. So I hope that definition is really helpful to frame the inquiry around cultural and spiritual appropriation. And one of the things that I could also say that's really important about it is that when we do have implicit biases or we're unfamiliar with these topics, it can be really hard to work with people of color. It can be really hard to work with people from different backgrounds, different gender identities, because we really haven't gone through this self-inquiry around where I might be holding on to implicit biases, and how that might be distracting me from really serving my clients well.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, I'd love to turn it over to you, Michaela. Maybe you can share a little bit more about why this conversation matters to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to start, kind of join with the framing that you just offered, by acknowledging, what is probably obvious, which is that we're coming to this conversation from the perspective of a white identity. I identify as a white American woman. And so, primarily we're speaking from that perspective, from that identity. And to a certain extent, we're speaking to other folks who are white identified, or at the very least, who are not Japanese identified. And that perspective has vast limitations. It has some opportunities, for us to speak to the ways in which we've had to get very, real and honest and reflective with ourselves, challenge implicit biases that we have brought to this work of working with Reiki, and finding ways of coming into integrity with it inside of our own practices. So that's the perspective, that's part of the perspective that we're speaking from. That's part of uh, an important part of the story that we'll be telling, and it's not the whole story. So we just wanted to acknowledge that, how that we're sharing about this, how we're speaking about this comes from a particular lens, a particular perspective that may not be the same as those of you listening. And so we're really hoping that this is an open conversation, and we want to hear as many different perspectives on this as possible. This is a topic that's been woven into my personal history with Reiki, really from the beginning, primarily because I had a long career in working in universities and focusing on social justice leadership development with students. And in the course of doing that work over a number of years, working with subjects like implicit bias, like cultural appropriation, like anti-racism work, doing really powerful work both for myself and with and on behalf of other white identified students, working to really self-reflect on the ways in which I have absorbed and reflected white supremacist culture in my life, in my my relationships. And that's very challenging work. It's profoundly rewarding work. It's lifelong work. And so I carried that work with me, and at a certain point in my life came to the system of Reiki for my own personal reasons. And Reiki became a really important aspect of personal transformation work, healing work that I was doing around some really painful and difficult things in my life, and became something that I wanted to continue to work with over time, ultimately that I wanted to share with other people. And to be perfectly honest, like sitting from my perspective now, about 9 years later, there was a certain way in which I kind of separated out that work with Reiki from this perspective I'd been cultivating for most of my adult life around self-awareness and cultural awareness around issues like appropriation. I knew that this was a practice that came from Japan. I did not know what that meant. There wasn't really much of anything in my early Reiki education that contextualized the system of Reiki as a Japanese art and explained the cultural context, the historic context into which Reiki was developed, why the elements are the way they are, where they came from in the spiritual and cultural history of Japan long before Usui created the system of Reiki. And there was a very obvious blending of aspects from other cultures into what we were learning as kind of standard traditional Usui Reiki, the most notable being the chakra system, which, there was a certain cognitive dissonance that I was working with, where I knew that the chakra system was not one that was commonly worked with or even at all during the time in Japan's history that this practice was developed. But I just kind of didn't question that. I just let it, I just took it for what it was. And I think that on a certain level I was so benefited by Reiki. I was so enamored of it. It was so important to me that I was intentionally overlooking those things. I was, there was a certain willful ignorance around that. And that began to form kind of a pressure inside of me. When you have that experience where you're ignoring something, that there's something going on that's not quite right, that's not quite aligned, that doesn't feel quite right. But everything else about it is good. And so you're just kind of ignoring that thing. And eventually that thing is going to assert itself if we ignore it long enough. And so that's, essentially what happened, that over time, this dissonance between feeling very connected with Reiki, but having to acknowledge that I did not know virtually anything about its cultural roots, and that I knew, right, I had a value system in place for a long time that told me that that was wrong, that that was out of integrity for me as a white American woman to be taking on a practice from another culture, particularly one that came into our country right at a time when America was persecuting Japanese Americans during World War II, and that this was a problem, that this was out of integrity. And when I finally really confronted that and acknowledged that, there was this bit of a crisis that happened for me, because I didn't know where to find the information, and I didn't know, whether or not I really could or should continue working with the system of Reiki. One of the things that we might touch on a little bit more in this later on this conversation is that there's a wide range of ways that people can respond to wanting to deal with cultural appropriation. It's a very wide range, and it can range from a belief that we should never engage in cultural ceremonies and practices and arts, markers of culture, from cultures outside of our own, particularly when there's a power dynamic, as you described in that definition, such as, white Americans in relationship with people of color inside of America. So that's kind of one extreme. And, the other extreme end would be just not caring about the topic at all. Right. And so, I was feeling the pull between this. I'd been ignoring this phenomenon the whole time I'd been working with Reiki. This was maybe 2 or 3 years into my practice. And on the other hand, I was well aware of the range of opinions and my own opinion about how one in my position with my identity can be in integrity with engaging in cultural aspects that are not from my own lineage. And inside of this kind of crisis, I decided that I really that I loved Reiki, that I felt deeply in relationship with it in a certain sense, and that I wanted to deepen that relationship inside of an integrous relationship. And so ultimately, I did seek out ways to learn and to broaden my understanding of where Reiki came from, how it came to be, and ultimately chose to really strip away as much as possible the aspects of my early Reiki education that were not those origins, to form a relationship with the origins of Reiki as much as I can, as someone who has not been to Japan, and then to rebuild my relationship on that solid ground. And that has been a profoundly rewarding and challenging and beautiful process that has been flawed, continues to be, but also continues to be really, that feels very much in line with my values and continues to be incredibly rewarding. So that's kind of where I would start this conversation, is a recognition of my own journey and an invitation to others on your journey to take a pause and to really reflect, what is my relationship with this practice, and what is it based in? What is it rooted on? And is that foundation as strong as possible in terms of reflecting and honoring and responding to the purpose of whatever this practice is that we're looking at? And so I will leave it there for the moment. Turn it back over to you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I love hearing your story, and I love hearing how you took something that felt really complicated. There was a really kind of messy, intuitive process for you, but through that process, you really discovered what your truth is, and the perspective that you really want to offer as a teacher and a healer. And I really commend you for that. I had a similar struggle. When I first found Reiki, it was all stars and stripes and crown chakra loveliness. And I had a beautiful, like, pure relationship with it, because it was totally unmarred by, judgments, criticism, self-critique. It was just like, oh, wow, this tool, this energy, this freedom that I felt with Reiki came to me in exactly perfect time in my life. It was so soothing and so healing and so transformative for me. And it really didn't take me long to just kind of jump right in to becoming a Reiki practitioner. And but in terms of cultural and spiritual appropriation, One of the things that this conversation has really sparked in me is this like going back into like, why did I choose Reiki in the first place? Why was this practice like so magical for me? Why did it feel like all the doors were open and I just had to go inside? And some of that is because I have a background in anthropology, and I have my undergraduate degree in anthropology, and I have like a deep love and respect for culture. And anthropology is kind of an interesting field in academia. It's definitely been accused of racism throughout its history. But when I was studying anthropology, it was during a time of immense globalization and a lot of discourse within academia around globalization. And I was studying like right around like 2000 to 2005. And there was so much concern about the global economy, the global nature of being connected to each other through internet, TV, all of the things, that it was just going to create such a vortex of change for small indigenous communities. And so there was a lot of conversation within anthropology around how do we preserve this culture so that at one point, these cultures can kind of take back their own lineages. They can take back some of their culture and traditions, because it was a time when so many of the young people in the cultures were being pulled out into a totally different way of life. I think of that as really relevant also to Reiki, because so much of the culture and tradition of Reiki, I think one of the reasons why it's led to its globalization, one of the things that has led to its globalization is that it was completely uprooted from Japan and taken to the West. And there it blossomed and grew into what it is today. But it probably wouldn't have grown that way had it stayed completely connected to Japan. And so an example I was thinking of, or a parallel, is like, no one in the West, or a white Western woman, wouldn't feel open to go to Japan and study the samurai tradition, for example. And I don't know that much about samurai, so I don't know like a whole correlation between there. But had Reiki stayed in Japan, I think that the white Western world, the metaphysical world, the spiritual, not religious community wouldn't have felt such an express license to take Reiki and kind of disseminate it, add to it, change it, manipulate it, to be what it is today. And that concerned me always about Reiki. And I always felt a sense of discomfort around teaching Reiki, especially teaching Reiki in a way that felt disingenuous, it felt disconnected to its roots. And I'm somebody who wants to always understand something really deeply before I feel really comfortable teaching it and sharing it with others. And there was this point in time when Reiki was just so open. It felt so freeing. It felt like this pathway to liberation. And I still feel that way about Reiki, but now knowing the history, knowing all the things that have been added and changed to the tradition of Reiki, it gives me a sense of discomfort to teach those aspects of Reiki that I know come from different sources. And I think we should think more critically at this juncture within Reiki. We just passed the 100-year mark of Reiki in existence as we know it. And I think we should think more critically about what we've added to the system of Reiki. What elements of Reiki that we've combined with either other cultural elements of different places, and if that alignment is actually really congruent. Does that serve the practice of Reiki? Does it help people heal? Is it more effective? I don't know the answer to those questions, and I think all of those questions are deeply interpersonal in the sense that each of us have to answer them for ourselves. And it leads us back to the title of our conversation about being true to our way. So how you might approach this subject, or how it might change the dynamic of how you teach and practice Reiki, is deeply personal. Nobody can tell you your way is right or wrong. but it does invite us into critical thinking about how we might have kind of taken Reiki like I did, just like, with this just love and joy and like a freedom to explore my spirituality within Reiki. But in that process, might have bent or manipulated the practice to distort it from its origins. So we're all a little guilty of spiritual appropriation. Nobody's completely clean, especially if you're a white Western person. But yeah, anyways, I'm sure that brings up something for you want to share.
Yeah, definitely. Because, the specific, history of a thing matters a great deal in the context of this kind of conversation. Because, the particular way and timing in which Reiki made its way into the United States and then into the West more broadly was very specific. And as a result of the way in which it came here, certain aspects of its origins were intentionally cloaked. And so, because of that, for many years, what was received in the West was a version of Reiki that had been intentionally scrubbed of specifically its esoteric Buddhist origins and many of its Shinto origins, out of necessity. As I mentioned earlier, it came into this country through Hawaii, through Hawaii Takata, who had trained in Japan, and had been given permission by the organization that kind of held Reiki to bring it here and to teach it. And she was of Japanese origins, living in Hawaii during a time when Hawaii wasn't even yet a state of the United States. It was still a territory that was ceded under duress. There was still struggle between indigenous Hawaiians and the United States government that ultimately resulted in Hawaii becoming a state. And it was right around, the era of World War II, when again, our government was imprisoning Japanese Americans and interning Japanese nationals. And so it was a very volatile time for a woman to be teaching a Japanese art, that she felt very passionate about and that felt that she really called to bring into her community. And so, there's a certain way in which it was brought here, like it was gifted to the West, but because of those conditions was necessarily cloaked, and specifically cloaked in a Christian story, cloaked in a way that again scrubbed those Buddhist origins from it, religious implications from it that associated with that. And so what we received was, this form that was already kind of scrubbed away. And to that form, because there is a strong impulse and permission inside of the United States to take on aspects of culture from lots of places, put it in the melting pot, melt it all down, combine it, make something new, use it for whatever we want to use it for. We have a strong, cultural ethos around this melting pot metaphor that we have in our country. That's exactly what happened, right? You put a little Reiki in, you put a little chakras in, you put a little Jesus in, you put a little angels in, you put a little whatever you got into the pot, and you stir it up and you bring something new forward. And, at the time, this was something that was very normal. And then you do that over and over and over again. You run it through the New Age movement, between the 1960s, 1980s. And, you have a situation where Reiki gets almost defined as this incredibly broad and malleable practice, experience that people feel all kinds of permission to make their own and change in any way that they see fit. And you see that very actively in conversations that you and I have had inside of various Reiki communities, where people will say, Reiki is for everybody. Reiki is everything. Anything can be adapted inside of Reiki. And I challenge that, right? To that, I generally would say that, Reiki, the phenomenon of Reiki, universal energy, spiritual energy, if one believes that this is a phenomenon that exists in the world, that it is inside of all of us, it binds us, it animates us, it's part of us, then yes, we're all going to have our own relationship with it. It's going to take form in our life in a variety of ways. We're going to understand it in different ways. We're going to express it in different ways. But if we're talking about a system of practice, right, that has a certain set of elements to it, that system of practice is a marker of culture, and it came from somewhere specific. It came from a cultural and historical context. It came from a particular group of people that's very specific. And so we, muddle the waters a little bit by using the term Reiki, which is a specific Japanese word describing this phenomenon, and apply it to all manner of systems of practice, many of which were invented over the last, few decades, as an amalgamation of a variety of different practices. But we give them all this name Reiki, instead of saying this is an energy practice that looks like this and has these elements, or I am giving this practice a new name that represents these different pieces, whatever the case. But it gets called Reiki. And so that's generated the belief and the feeling that Reiki is something very general. And it's just not. It's something very specific. And so there's easy ways to remedy this in terms of how we relate to Reiki. We no longer have to cloak what Reiki was, right? The cultural conditions of the 1940s have changed. We no longer need to pretend that it's something that it wasn't. And we now have enough information available, not 100% of information. There's quite a bit about the origins of Reiki, the cultural traditions it comes from that are very hard to understand and come by, let alone practice. Again, Reiki is born out of traditions that are hundreds, if not thousands of years old. And so, we can never, as Western people, fully embody and understand it, but there's quite a bit that we can specifically know about what Reiki is, where it came from, who created this particular form of practice, which is, as you say, about 100 years old. And what it meant, right? What its purpose is and was, which is different from how it's understood inside of Western contexts. And then from that basis of clear as possible information, from that strong foundation, then we can look to our own experiences, our own traditions, and say, okay, what does this have to do with, for example, my Celtic heritage, right? There's a tremendous amount of overlap between the nature-based Shinto practices that are part and parcel of Reiki and the nature-based practices of ancient Celtic people, which are my people, right? So I've been able to bring those traditions together inside of my practice in a way that feels like it has strong integrity, and that's rooted in my value system and in my lineage, and that honors the similarities while also acknowledging the differences. And so that's a really, I think, powerful place for us all to start is, can we get as clear as possible about what we're dealing with? What are the pieces? If we want to work with the chakra system, that's fine. But do we understand that system in its context from India? And do we understand that it's different from Reiki, right? That it is a different tradition. It is a different set of principles and practices that are related, that have similarities, but come from very different places. And so that if we choose to blend them, we understand why. We understand where they came from. We understand those differences, and we can communicate that. To your point of the responsibility that we take on when we choose to teach, formally or informally, or otherwise, just even talk about these practices with other people. How are we communicating about it? These are the kinds of questions that have been really formative for me over the years, as I have worked through this question of how can I be in integrity with this practice, given my identity, and how I share it with other folks.
Yeah, it's a really diverse and deep concept, and I love how you've approached it. And some of the things, I think what might be useful is to share a few examples of how cultural appropriation can harm culture. And so I have this example from the course that I took on cultural and spiritual appropriation within yoga. And that was a course that I was, this conversation around cultural and spiritual appropriation has really come from yoga. And as a yoga teacher, I've been really interested in it and trying to learn more about it. And then it got me thinking about, well, how is this applicable to Reiki? And so, there's a lot of, there's a lot of different cultures out there. There's a lot of spiritual healing techniques out there. There are a lot of different ways of thinking through different religious lenses. And one of the benefits of us living in the globalized society that we have is that there are things like Wikipedia, that there is this openness, this permeability of culture. And that we're not guided by just one religion or one point of view, one perspective, but there's drawbacks to that too. So there's benefits and drawbacks to that. But for example, in the course that I took with Neil Dahl, he talked about how he had this case of like a post on Instagram of this woman who felt intuitively guided to create this vegan shaman drum and design this beautiful lotus on the drum, and then trace the outline of the Gayatri mantra in the vegan drum. And then, it was inspired to sell it in their Instagram shop. And the problematic thing with that is that from his, and India is very diverse. There's lots of different subcultures within India. So it's not, across the board, this is the case, but at least from the subculture that Neil is a part of, he said that the Gayatri mantra is secret and sacred. It's not meant to be chanted out loud. It's not even meant to be read. And so if somebody who was from that culture saw this post, or they would consider that really sacrilegious. And other examples are like pictures of Ganesh on alcohol bottles. All of that is very sacrilegious to an Indian person. And it also begs the question of like, what aspects of Western Reiki might feel really disingenuous or, again, sacrilegious to a Japanese American person or a Japanese person. And that's one that points me to a little bit more towards my why, is that I want to hold, a diverse space in my Reiki trainings. And I think it's important that, tools like Reiki, spiritual healing like Reiki, is, accessible to all different types of people with different gender identities, people with different races, religions. And there's a sense of discomfort when you're teaching Reiki and then a Japanese person in your class would feel offended by the way you're speaking about their culture. And then there's also this discomfort around different aspects of Reiki being combined with other techniques. And so, we all know that there are so many different types of Reiki these days. And two of the ones that really come, there's several on my radar, and I don't mean to name names, but I think they do exemplify a lot of these the conditions that we've been talking about in terms of appropriation. But like there's Sicham Reiki, which is a combination of some connections to ancient Egypt healing techniques or energy healing techniques and combining them with Reiki. Also Kundalini Reiki, combining, aspects of, again, Indian cosmology and energy with Reiki. And, again, there might be something useful in that connection to each other, but I think that's always really helpful to look very deeply about why we're combining something with Reiki. Like, is there something missing within the system of Reiki that isn't being represented? And sometimes a lot of that, I feel like, kind of draws lines around just trying to be an exceptional healer within the system. Like it's about, creating more fame or notoriety. But what gets lost in that is the strength of the lineage. And when we're constantly changing what is Reiki or filtering it through our own perception of what it should be or what it isn't, or our own spirituality, it waters down the practice for our students. And when I first learned yoga, and when I first learned, mostly yoga, there was a lot of this emphasis. A lot of people would always ask me like, oh, are you going to create your own style of yoga? And that was like the goal. That was kind of taught to me or portrayed to me through different means. And I never felt really comfortable with that because I didn't feel like that was an alignment of my truth. And what this conversation really helped me feel more integrity about is that I want to preserve the authenticity of the Reiki that I know and embody in such a way that it feels really alive for my students, and that it preserves the lineage for many generations to come. And so I think we need more of that in Reiki. Yeah.
You're bringing up an interesting, piece of the subtleties of this, of what we're talking about and dealing with here. And the fact that, as I said before, we all need to really make our own decisions about what fuels in integrity and what doesn't. There will always be disagreement about that, right? And so I've come to terms with the fact that there will always be folks who fundamentally will disagree with the fact that I choose to practice Reiki as a white woman, that for some people will just be fundamentally wrong and shouldn't be done. So I have to be at peace with my decision to do it anyway. And then, okay, how can I be at peace with that based on how I engage? And so when you talk about something like Kundalini Reiki or, these other kind of blends, right? We can look at that on the surface and not know much about what's actually happening there, right? Because one could have a very strong understanding of the origins of Reiki and a very strong understanding of the origins of Kundalini, and bring them together in a way that's very authentic and very, and that's, from a certain perspective in integrity. And that could be done not well, the opposite of that, right? And so, I think the questions that you were posing there are really right on. Like, why are we bringing these things together? Is it necessary? Why do we feel the need to modify something? It might just be because we don't even know that we're modifying, right? So back to the original, the idea that Reiki came into the United States modified and then was modified over and over and over again over decades. And so Western Reiki is, by a certain definition, modified, right? Continuously modified, reinvented, and imagined. And so some would say, well, what's wrong with that? That is Western Reiki. Western Reiki has that characteristic, right? If that's a person's firm belief, then that's how they get to operate inside of it. I have changed my belief about that. Okay, so then how do I need to deal with that? One of the things that I've become aware of in reflecting on my own relationship with Reiki and then observing other people in conversation about it is that, aspects of American culture are all up in this, right? So I mentioned the melting pot analogy and how that, gives us permission to do this blending. But another piece that I think is important here, and that gets to your examples, is that we tend to be very averse to simplicity. We tend to want things to be complex. We want to be very goal-oriented. The goal is to get something better and bigger than where we started, right? Go big or go home, supersize it, make it more complex, mix it up. This is kind of part of our culture, particularly the capitalist elements of our culture. And so when we look at the elements of the original system of Reiki, it is profoundly simple, right? It is essentially live your life as an embodiment of these 5 precepts, and here are some practices that will help you do that. And those practices are by and large simple. They're not easy, right? They're deep, they're profound. They can take you to incredible places, but on their surface, they're simple. And I know for me, I went through a period, in those early days where if it was simple, I did not perceive it as being effective. I did not perceive it as being as in-depth or profound as I wanted it to be. And this was flawed thinking, right? This was, in a sense, a way of getting out of doing the work that's necessary to embody a simple and profound practice. Just make it more, just bring in more. I studied all these different types of Reiki. Like every time I would hit a wall and it would get difficult, I would be like, well, let's just add in a new type. Let's do, Karuna Reiki. Let's do this other kind of Reiki. And it was this constant chase of complexity. And my experience personally with Reiki, and in terms of the Reiki I was sharing with other people, got less and less effective as I went down this spiral of complexity. And so I think that is, firstly, particular to me, but I think it also is reflective of something about our culture. And so when I see all of these blendings, right, you named some examples, we want to really look, is that because we don't think Reiki on its own terms is good enough, right? Is powerful enough, is complex enough, is sexy enough? So we need to bring these other things? Or do we feel in our bones and our body and our spirit, because of our lived experience and our study and our knowledge and our engagement with these systems, that there is a strong reason to bring these things together? And when we do that, do we understand what these things are individually on their own and how they work together and how they might not, right? And so on the surface, we don't know if a person has gone through any of that, right? And so, this is where we have to have more bravery and more compassion in having these kinds of conversations, because it's important to be able to feel brave and safe enough to ask somebody, how did you come to this particular blending of things? Help me understand why this makes sense. And maybe I'll come around to that, right? Help me understand why something that looks like it might be cultural appropriation actually, has the level of depth and respect and understanding that takes it out of that category. And I'll give you an example, just from my own personal experience. Part of my engagement with the roots of Reiki has involved studying esoteric Buddhism, specifically Shingon Buddhism, over the last 3 years, because that's one of the important, foundational practices inside of the origins of Reiki. And in the process of doing that, I came into relationship with a particular deity inside of Shingon that I relate to in metaphoric ways that are really important to me. And particularly over the first year of COVID, I worked with this deity, this imagery, this metaphor very, very, very deeply. And it was very important to my experience at that time. And my personal life history has involved chronicling my life through tattooing. I have a lot of tattoos everywhere that chronicle really important parts of my life. And so I felt very strongly that I wanted to have this deity tattooed on me. And I knew, and it happens to be one that a lot of people get tattooed. And I knew that I would be putting myself in a position of being another white person with this Japanese god tattooed on me. And that people were going to perceive that however they were going to perceive it, right? Which could include people looking at it and saying, there's another white girl walking around with, a Japanese tattoo they don't understand, right? And that I had to be okay with that, because I can't explain myself to everybody, right? And people are going to have the perspectives that they have. But it was a serious consideration, because I don't want my body, the way I present myself, to be offensive, right? And so it was a real tussle, and it just ultimately it was this is what I need to do for myself. And so that's this piece that you see right here. And so that's, it's something that, but I have these moments, right, where I'll meet somebody that I, know to be of Japanese heritage, and I wonder, what do they think about this, right? And do we have an opportunity to have a conversation with it? And it's still a point of conflict, because again, I don't want to give the perception of being somebody who steals from other cultures without thinking about it, without doing, without putting proper investment of time and energy into it. And that'll continue to be a conversation that I have with myself. So
yeah, I think it's what I read out of what you were saying is that it's to know our why, right, and to know our why. And I struggle the same with that. I love to design malas, And malas are a tool from Hinduism, from Buddhism, from yoga. It's 108 beads with a knot between each bead. And there's a lot of different techniques out there, but they come from, not my cultural tradition, but my chosen cultural tradition of yoga. And there's a lot of discussion about malas are all spiritually appropriative. You should be wearing them. It's disrespectful. You can't wear them here. You can't wear them there. There's something that you should have in your own private space. And I really struggled with that because I love them. And in particular, I love them for protection. And when I wear my mala, I feel very protected. And so I have a whole bunch of malas that are just specifically for protection. And so I struggle with this kind of religiosity or dogma associated with like, this is the tool and this is how it's used. And I do respect that there's this cultural tradition related to malas. And so, how I've navigated that is that I've sought out a teacher from that tradition, a non-white teacher who has taught me a traditional mala tying technique. She also has family still connected in Nepal, and they mine a lot of the beads there. And so there's this, and then I also donate $1 for every mala I sell to the World Wildlife Fund. And so there's this structure that I tried to build within my business, that there is this kind of circular nature of giving back. So giving back to my teacher who taught me this technique, giving back to the planet for giving us these beautiful stones to wear, these gemstones to wear. And so I know that maybe somebody might see my mala and say, oh, you shouldn't be wearing it like this, or, might find it offensive that a white woman is tying a mala. But, I spent almost my whole life on a yoga mat, and the traditions of yoga and Reiki have been deeply influential to me, and they mean the world to me. And it feels very important to me, like that there's this creative process that I really enjoy. And so some people might look at it differently than the way I look at it. And even back to my prior example, of somebody making a drum with the Gayatri mantra, it's important not to judge, but there is a role, I think, of policing within the conversation around cultural and spiritual appropriation. And so the way I learned to navigate that is always looking for the indigenous right away. So if there is a culture that has been systemically oppressed, or has survived genocide, cultural genocide, then we have to stand up for that culture. And if we see things that feel like that they are against the cultural traditions, then it might be helpful to at least speak to it, or at least inquire, or at least try to understand why that person might be doing what they're doing. And I know that there's a really strong conversation around this within especially Native American communities in the United States, who are the survivors of like 400, 500 years of cultural and racial genocide, of just genocide in general. And, so when they say, don't sage, or I'm offended by your sage, that's where I really try to listen. I really try to listen to them and to their requests, and also be really mindful about how I'm incorporating, any sort of culture, from anything from a very oppressed culture, how I'm integrating that into my Reiki practice, or into my healing practice, that goes against the grain and actually circles back to them in a way that's supportive to that community.
Yeah. Well, and that, kind of brings us to one of the places we wanted to really land in this conversation, which is, what are some of the beginning steps that a person can take to perhaps begin to shift their relationship with Reiki in the direction of being more true to the origins of the system. This is a conversation that can feel very overwhelming, particularly if one is new to it, hasn't really given it a thought, maybe didn't realize how many layers of modification that Reiki has gone through. And I know that, even as somebody who's worked with these kinds of concepts for decades, it's still an intimidating conversation, right? And so, as you mentioned just a moment ago, right, like there's ways that we can engage these conversations that can actually cause more harm, right? Where we shame people for things that they don't know or things that they've chosen to do, where we, make people wrong for practicing in a particular way. And particularly if someone has not yet learned that there are these other ways of practicing, or that they're, has not yet questioned whether or not the way that they know Reiki might, have some cultural appropriation to it. We want to be able to have these conversations in a way that is compassionate. That is an embodiment of the precepts of Reiki, which is to not be attached to fear or anger around these conversations, and is to be compassionate with each other. And so, for those who are just maybe starting to work with these concepts, or just starting to have an interest in understanding more about what it means to practice Reiki in a way that is not culturally appropriative, what would you suggest? How would you suggest people begin? What is like one step that people can take to begin moving in this direction?
Yeah, well, I think I'm going to create a little document, and it'll be in the show notes. That's just a little synopsis of the call and 5 ways in which I think that you can work to do less appropriative things within Reiki. But I really just start with, with looking at your relationship to Reiki. Yeah. Going into a place of self-inquiry and inviting in where we feel really connected to Reiki, like where is that for us? Like, how has it helped us? How has it supported us? And then also looking into our expression of Reiki. So how do you give Reiki to others? And you might just give it to yourself, curious about the practice. And I often say that I think in that case, the question around cultural and spiritual appropriation, it might be interesting to you, but perhaps not as valid. I think when it becomes very valid is if you are a teacher of Reiki. And I think there's a hierarchy. There's like, being a teacher of Reiki is that you're embodying a lineage. So how are you teaching this practice to your students? Do you feel like in alignment with that? There might be a need to explore that deeper, or to study it deeper, which I know can be really challenging for a small business. But then I think there's also hierarchy in terms of the heads of these lineages that really create the story around Reiki. Organizations like Reiki Raise and Reiki.org, that they're really, because they're such a big part of the way Reiki is being languaged and disseminated, there's an important piece there to look a little bit more deeply as to how is that story in alignment with the real truth of Reiki, of how Reiki, can be practiced more authentically.
Yeah.
So, and then I also really encourage you to study cultural and spiritual appropriation from a non-white teacher, and learn from their perspective and from their stories about what it's like to be different in a white, or be different from the dominant culture that we were raised in. And listening and elevating those voices. In some senses, there's a misalignment around us being 2 white women talking about cultural appropriation, because it's really a conversation where we need to like not talk about it and sit in the back and like listen. But
we're using our platform and this opportunity to speak to, encourage these conversations. And beginning with listening and learning, right? I mean, I'm an academic at heart to my bones, and so I'm always going to start with research and learning. And in a couple of different directions. One, really, as you said, finding folks of Japanese origins who are teaching and speaking to Reiki. One person that you and I both have a lot of respect for is Marika Clymer. Her her business is called The Energy Ecologist. there's another woman called the energetic alchemist, and I always bring those two together. The energy ecologist, and she works with Reiki from the perspective that actually goes long before Mikao Usui's time developing the system of Reiki that came into the United States. She works with Reiki from the perspective of its Japanese indigenous roots, its Shinto roots, as her, a person who comes from those lineages. And so we'll put her information. She's done a lot of podcast interviews. She has a lot of really powerful, first of all, information from that perspective, but also really powerful advice to those of us kind of in our position, white folks who want to work with Reiki and I want to do that in a way that is in integrity. She speaks about that a lot and has a lot of really powerful things to teach us about that. So we'll put her information below. And then if you want to, I feel like, again, the best way to really root ourselves and to really ground ourselves in what Reiki is, where it came from, is to learn about those origins. And so, depending on how nerdy you want to get with it, right? I get pretty nerdy with this stuff. There's really wonderful resources to study esoteric Japanese Buddhism, Shingon and Tendai. There's a book on Shinto. Shinto is a notoriously challenging spiritual perspective to teach outside of Japan because it is so deeply ingrained and was oral tradition for so long that it's really quite challenging to just explain outside of the context that it developed inside of. But there is a book that does a really good job, I think, of doing that. It's called The Essence of Shinto, Japan's Spiritual Heart, by Motohisa Yamakage. And that does a really beautiful job of teaching to those origins. And you'll see, whispers of Reiki inside of the way that it's discussed. So we'll put that resource in the notes as well. And so there's many, many, many ways to root ourselves in those origins. Learning about the Meiji Restoration, which is the historical time period that Mikao Usui grew up in and created the system inside of, just gives us so much context for what this practice is. And so that's what I would recommend, is that folks get really curious and get nerdy and get excited about learning about history, learning about culture, learning about the way things came to be and why. And then from there, you can start taking a look at your own practice, your own relationship with Reiki, and start, teasing out the pieces that are really you, that are present in your practice because of your own history, and the pieces that really should be there because of its own history. So that's where I would recommend that folks start. We'll leave a variety of resources that can help you get started on that process in the document that Carrie mentioned. And we would love to have this conversation with you. This, as we mentioned before, is not an easy conversation, but it's an important one. And it's one that if we approach with compassion and connection and curiosity, we can become better people inside of this conversation. And so I urge us to do that because, most of us come to Reiki because we want to do good in the world. And this is one of those ways we can do that.
I love that. I love that note to end on. And I feel like the topic of cultural and spiritual appropriation has made me a better person. And for that, I'm so truly grateful. So this is the end of video 3 of Being True to Your Way, Navigating the Role of Integrity for Reiki Practitioners. Just as a reminder, we're kind of sharing our platforms, a back and forth dialogue. So this conversation is going to be held on Reiki Healing Society's YouTube channel, but look for the next video in this series on Michaela's HeartScapes Reiki channel.
And in each of those videos, we'll put links to the others in the series as they get produced, and so that you can find all of them.
Exactly. I'm really looking forward to that call with you, Michaela, and looking forward to sharing the insights and hearing from you all who are listening, what you think about these topics and how they might be inspiring you to be a better person. All right. Thanks so much again for joining us, folks. And until next time, be very well.
Bye-bye.